Chapter 28, Section 2, Western Democracies Stumble. What political and economic challenges did leading democracies face in the 20s and the 30s? And they're going to focus mostly on the United States, Great Britain, and France. So what were the domestic and foreign policy issues Europe faced after World War I? Compare post-war economic situations in Britain, France, the U.S. How did the Great Depression begin and spread? And then how did these countries, Britain, France, United States, try to address the issues of the Great Depression? So if we look at politics in the post-war world, what we see in Great Britain in the follow-up after World War I is that there's 3 or 4 major political parties in Great Britain. And what's a little bit different in the democracy of Britain compared to the United States is that they have these coalition governments. So for example, if one party gets 20% of the vote, they get 20% of the representatives. In the United States, it's a winner-take-all system. Whoever gets 50 plus 1% of the vote wins, and they get the seats. And so it's a winner-take-all system versus a proportional system that's in Great Britain. One of the other things that happens in Great Britain is Ireland had been pushing for independence for a long time. They finally get it in 1918. And so most of Ireland becomes independent. This northern part of Ireland opts to stay with Great Britain and is still aligned with Great Britain today. France is kind of going to go through the same thing, troubled peace. Post-war, you really see this struggle taking place between socialists, communists, nationalists, and so all of these places are dealing with these internal struggles. For the United States, the issues that we're really facing is the Red Scare and isolationism. Our biggest fear is that communism is going to come to, and socialism is going to come to the United States. And one of the things that's feeding that fear is at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 1900s, the United States is getting more and more immigrants from Russia, Poland, and so from Central and Eastern Europe. And we fear that socialism and communism and Bolshevism is going to get exported to the United States. And so we're going to clamp down on immigration. The other thing is we really are disillusioned over World War I. And so what the United States is going to do is it's going to use the 2 huge oceans to keep us isolated from the rest of the world's problems. And we're really going to turn inward, and we're going to shut the world out. We're going to place high tariffs on other places. We're going to withdraw from foreign diplomacy. So there's all kinds of issues going on within the United States. The other thing that's going to take place post-World War I is that the Allies aren't going to be as united as they were before. What this picture is, it's a picture of the Maginot Line. France builds this huge defensive structure along the border between Great Britain, or Germany, and France. The ironic thing is, because of the way that they designed it, it was never used in World War II. They had their guns cemented in, so they only faced one direction. They couldn't rotate. And so once the Germans got behind this Maginot Line, it really didn't do any good. But that's what France's main goal is to protect themselves from Germany for the rest of eternity. For Great Britain, shortly after the peace treaty, they start to regret some of the terms of the treaty, and they realize that treaty was probably a bit too harsh, and they want to undo certain parts of the treaty. So you're going to see France and Great Britain get pulling apart. So one of the things you're going to see also post-World War I is this search for peace. Countries are going to become obsessed with trying to figure out ways to peacefully coexist. So you're going to see the Locarno Treaty that the book talks about. But the other thing is the Kellogg-Briand Pact. The Kellogg-Briand Pact brings most of the countries of the world together, and what they're going to agree to do is not use war as a way to solve problems. It essentially outlaws war, but there's really no consequences for doing it or for going to war. The other thing that they're going to do is they're going to agree to disarmament. They're going to shrink the size of their militaries. Ideally, the League of Nations would have been the thing that could have solved a lot of these problems. But the fact that the United States never joined the League of Nations really weakens it from the beginning. And then we're going to see that when Japan invades Manchuria and the League tells them to get out, not to do it, but there's no consequences or repercussions for a country doing it. And Adolf Hitler is going to watch that pretty closely and realize that the League of Nations really is a bit of a joke. If we look at post-war economics, the situation in Great Britain is they have extremely high debt because of the war effort. They also have high unemployment, and wages are not keeping pace with inflation. So they have an awful lot of economic issues. France seems to recover pretty quickly, and they're interesting because they're not going to get impacted quite as much by the Great Depression and some of the post-war things as the rest of the world is. For the United States, we're going to go on an economic boom. Shortly after the war, we hit a bit of a bump in the road as we're transitioning from wartime to peacetime. But after that, if you look at this Dow Jones, which is kind of a measure of the United States' biggest companies, you're going to see that their stock prices are going to soar and rise pretty dramatically. Now that's going to create some problems a little bit later on because you can see the fall that takes place during the Great Depression. But throughout most of the 1920s, the United States is rolling along pretty good. So when we look at the Great Depression, what is it that caused it? Now again, historians are going to disagree on which of these things is the biggest cause, but essentially most historians are going to point to all of these things as being pretty much part of the problem. So one is demand. What's going to happen throughout the 1920s is shortly after the war, Americans go on a buying spree. And then once they've bought, whether it be washing machines or cars, there's going to be a decrease in demand. And at the same time, factories are going to produce as if the demand is going to be high forever, so there's overproduction. So now what you have is you have low demand, high supply, and that's really going to impact prices. The other thing is when you look at monetary policy, the high tariffs that we're placing on other places, the war debts that these countries are carrying, all of those things are going to factor into the stock market crash, and then that's going to kind of spread the collapse of this economic crisis. And the depression is going to spread from the United States across the world. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is, for example, in American agriculture, American farmers had been in the depression since the early 1920s. Germany had been in the depression since the mid-20s. So there's some places where the depression already existed, but now with the United States economy going into the tank, it's going to kind of gradually spread throughout the rest of the world. So when we look at the reaction to the depression, Great Britain is going to build a coalition government. They're going to bring all these rival political parties together to try and figure out how they're going to solve this problem. They are going to give some unemployment benefits to their people, but the thing is with this coalition government, there's no clear leader, so there's no clear action, and they just kind of muddle along a little bit. When we look at France, France isn't impacted as bad, and it's impacted much later on, and they're going to kind of suffer the same thing. They lacked really strong leadership at this time because of all the different rival parties that are kind of tearing at France. For the United States, President Herbert Hoover is in office during the Great Depression. He gets replaced by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Franklin Roosevelt's going to hit the ground running. He has a pretty clear plan as to how he is going to deal with the Great Depression, and it's going to be 3 R's. Relief, so get people who need the most help. Recovery, how are we going to get the nation back on its feet again? How are we going to get businesses up and running again? And the third thing is reform. How can we fix the problems that led to the Great Depression in the first place? And those 3 things are going to make up the New Deal. So one of the things, for example, that they do is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. They're going to take young men who are unmarried and they're going to move them across the United States, and they're going to work on different projects. One of the closest projects is Echo Valley Park outside of West Union. They built a man-made lake. They built walking trails. And what they did is they took those young men, gave them jobs, and it also made it so that married men didn't have competition for jobs. The other thing that's going to hit the United States at the same time as the Great Depression is the Dust Bowl. We're going to go through a series of droughts in the early to mid 1930s, and there's certain portions of the country, the panhandle of Texas and Oklahoma in particular, are going to be devastated by this drought. And what's going to happen is, because they plowed up native grasses, and then you throw that drought in there, almost all the topsoil is going to blow away. So here are a couple of pictures. That is not a snow drift. That is a dirt drift that has drifted over a shed. They would get up to second-story windows sometimes, these dirt drifts of all this dirt that's blowing away.